This is Fan Reluctant Ghost. We're on the air with Dr. H. And so, how you
Hi,
doing tonight?
I'm
Um,
good. Thanks for the invite.
and we love to talk to people from around the world. We have our live podcast. We've been on the air since 2016, over 1,200 episodes. And when we talk to every guest on the show, we always ask a couple questions before we get to the heart of your story. What motivates you, and why do you do what you do?
Yeah, so I see so many couples that have been struggling in their marriage, been unhappy for years. And so the ability to turn that around and actually have people leave the office holding hands or sometimes making out in the waiting room, I mean, it feels amazing to get them back on track. And that's why I do it.
Well, it's cool to pay it forward. Always do something. I talk to a lot of people that what their purpose is to actually lift other people up or help people. So that's interesting. Um, so like, you've been a doctor in this area. Is this the area of psychology in terms of like couples and marriages? Is that where you were always focused on?
No, actually, I started my career in neurofeedback and in more of like the neuroscience side, doing more kind of individual work, insomnia, anxiety, panic disorder, things of that nature. And I remember the client and the moment where I realized I needed to start doing neurofeedback. And basically, she was having insomnia issues, and we were trying all these different things to try to help her, and it wasn't working. And I finally asked her a couple more questions, and long story short, she said, I can't stand my partner who sleeps next to me every night.
Yeah,
And I
that's
went, I was like, well, it's going to be hard to sleep then. And so, yeah, exactly. So my parents had been doing couples therapy and running retreats for a few decades. So I consulted with them, got some tips, and then pretty quickly started to really just love doing that work. And in the pandemic, then it became my full-time job because there were so many couples that were struggling, 2021 and even till now.
Yeah, I think they say like average marriage, it's like 50% divorce rate or higher. Um, yeah, I think it's a lot of times it's like, you know, why do people come together? Are they really the right match? And even if you're not the right match, if you want to work, can you make it work? I think there was a couple of questions where, you had is like, can you have opposites attract, or does that actually really work?
Yeah.
If you're incompatible, like because sometimes I go back and look at sometimes my parents and my grandparents,
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes like you if you listen to their stories, it's like, wow, they really weren't that compatible.
Well, and it's funny when you say are opposites compatible? Well, opposite magnetic poles are very compatible, right?
Hmm.
So compatibility usually has to do with very fundamental questions about how people want to live their lives. So if your partner wants to have kids and you don't want kids, if your partner wants to live in the city and you want to live in the country or by the ocean, or things of that nature, those are incompatibilities. And from a biological perspective, there's actually a lot of good research about how opposites really do attract. And I don't know how much you want to get into some of that, like science and pheromones and all that, but I mean, people are attracted generally to others that have different genetic makeup than themselves. And this comes out in the pheromones and the scent. And so one of the questions I ask every couple is, well, what was your chemistry like when you were dating? And
Hmm.
generally, if there was good chemistry, there's a way to rekindle and respark. If someone got pregnant and then you're like, okay, we should probably get married, that prognosis isn't typically as good. You can find ways to build that relationship, but it's much easier if you had good chemistry in the beginning.
Yeah, because you go back to your grandparents, and a lot of times people were like, they got married because they got pregnant. Yeah.
Right. Or that was the guy down the road. Well, he seems kind of safe. He's probably going to be a good father or a good supporter or whatever. And, let's
Yeah,
just,
maybe you weren't so like attracted to them, but you thought they were more stable. So the chemistry really wasn't there, but you were
right.
kind of playing it safe and say, I think this guy is more stable than the person I really like.
Right.
Right. And then you were like, then that's like, okay, well, how are you making that work?
I feel like you just described half the rom-coms in the 90s.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of, like it's a recurring theme.
It is for
It's like
sure.
it's like a bad loop. I'm a musician, so we run into those. But the idea of you know, I think sometimes people have this idealism and romanticism about like what is a marriage about, right? And sometimes people are looking for their soulmate to complete them, right? But like it's kind of the old adage: if you don't love yourself, right, then you're how is your soulmate ever going to really love you? That's not really going to work.
Yeah, I often talk with couples about distinguishing codependency versus collaboration. And that if you're depending on your partner to provide love because you don't have it towards yourself, or you're depending on your partner to create a life that you're looking for, that's usually going to fail at some point, very tragically often. But if you're building it together, if you're working in synergy with each other, then that can be amazing. And also then you're building your own self-love in this example too, which is you know is very much needed.
And also, like, does society really train people on how to actually behave in a relationship? You know, because it's like everything we do, we go through all this. You go to get college, you get your bachelor's degree, you get your master's degree, your PhD. But do people actually teach people how to actually communicate? Like, what are like the maybe not the proper etiquette, like etiquette classes, but the idea of like how do you actually behave, behavioral like understands, and people don't find out about that until they talk to a therapist, talk to a psychologist, talk to a sociologist. It's like it's not really trained.
No, it's not. And unfortunately, the pandemic made that a lot more difficult for people that are younger, and their, formative adolescent years were spent in isolation or only with their family, or, things of that nature. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, whether it's communication or whether it's emotional intelligence, I mean, these are a lot of the skills that are lacking in, I mean, even elementary school,
Yeah. So by the time you start trying to date, like you maybe aren't in a really good place to date. And so what your goals are maybe are like misconstrued with what is the best outcome.
Yeah.
Because like as an artist and a creative, I really dived into the filters people use, right? The
Hmm.
filters you have in your life. And the artists, we have these filters, we absorb a lot, and then we kind of synthesize what we absorb
Yep.
around us. And some of it's subconscious, some of it's from the outside, some of it's wherever it's coming from. But like if you don't understand those filters, we like you could get into what I said, like bad loops, because the way you perceive something, like you have a preconceived notion that you're always going to fall back on.
Yeah, and I like to think of that as, like, for example, people that have certain attachment issues, childhood traumas, loops they're stuck in that were set many, many years ago. And also, there's a lot of unspoken assumptions in relationships. I'm thinking of a couple I worked with recently where they were talking about how they want more kindness in their marriage. And she kept saying, like, I just need kindness. I need kindness. And he was like, fed up with this. And so I
You know,
finally said to her, well,
that's the
give an
thing.
example. What do you mean by kindness? And she said, well, when we're at a party together, I want to be able to have conversations with people and you're not correcting me. Like, we can both add to the conversation. And it was so funny because he said, oh, I thought I was being kind because you were looking stupid in front of your friends when you give the wrong information. And so their definitions were just so different. But no
There's
one,
this total disconnect.
yeah, but no one had ever sat them down and said, define what you mean by this. And that's
That's the problem.
part of it.
Yeah, well, that's the thing is like people make all these assumptions about terminology. I went to a liberal arts school. I took sociology and political science double major at Bowdoin. But the idea of like the critical thinking and the listening skills, people tend to, they never have that conversation. Like I remember sitting down with my parents and it's like, and they would have these arguments about like expectations, and they never really defined each other's expectations.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things that were totally assumed for like decades.
Right.
And you're like, you guys never sat down and talked about what it was.
And the reasons behind it, which I find are really important, so I might say kindness is important to me in a relationship, and you could leave it there if you wanted to, but there's a lot of benefit to actually going deeper. So for example, I might say kindness is important to me because I grew up in a home with domestic violence, and I'm making this up for this
Yeah,
context
yeah.
here. But if I grew up in a home with domestic violence, if I grew up in a home where my dad was constantly cheating on my mom, like I would just say, I just want a sanctuary. I want peace. I want kindness. And so when you understand, again, the root of it, like you said before, Phantom, that's where you get to build intimacy then with your partner, not just giving an ultimatum. Well, you need to be kind to me, because that's not going to work either.
And also, like, the idea of people's idea of sensuality or sex, maybe like some of the old school stuff that I saw with previous generations is like there was really no intimacy. It's kind of it's a duty. Like you're supposed to have sex at this time on a Saturday night or whatever. Like it's kind of like it wasn't really very connected, like
Mm-hmm.
to like eventually like that's not going to work because it's just like a routine that it's going to kind of fizzle out because you don't have the chemistry really isn't there. It's just like, well, it's like you're just doing this task because you're like obligated to do it,
Yeah.
and it is no real connection, and like you wonder why it starts to fade.
Yeah, I mean, some people like to go to the same restaurant every Thursday and get chicken parmesan, but that doesn't typically work well in relationships. And something that's often missed is that we have this notion and stereotype that in a sexless marriage, that the wife is withholding. In a heterosexual relationship, that the
Yeah,
wife is withholding. But actually, the research shows that it's typically the man that
man,
withholds
withholding.
sex.
It's always more than what it seems because like that's like the stereotypical preconceived notion is like although like you said like because we have these approaches that are kind of dogma or
Yeah.
social mores and norms and we've got these people just assume it all the time and you know what happens if you assume it like my grandpa would always tell me like not to do that but in terms of like of a pillars of a happy marriage, I mean there's multiple pillars and it's probably different for different people's experiences, but what are like the common threads that you could apply to like any relationship?
Yeah. So, I mean, as you said before, 50% of marriages end in divorce. Generally speaking, there's obviously wide range depending on a variety of factors there. But what a lot of people are not aware of is that in addition to that, in about 30% of marriages, at least one spouse is unhappy. And
Mm,
so only 20% of marriages are actually happy and long lasting and mutually fulfilling. And I usually tell couples that that's the doom and gloom. But the good news is that that group has been studied at great lengths. And we know in the positive psychology world, in the solution focused world, we know a lot about what those couples are doing right and how they're creating that happy marriage. And that's what I base a lot of my work on. So when I read that literature, I kind of see it in four categories. It's about how you communicate with your partner. It's about how you regulate with strong emotion or you co-regulate together. It's about how you prioritize your partner and your marriage. And that's through your acts, your words, your behaviors, your intentions, all of that. And then also how you build intimacy, physical, sexual, emotional, and in some couples, in some cases, spiritual intimacy as well. So those four factors are what I assess before people show up for a retreat. I assess at the end of the retreat, and we kind of talk about it throughout the time to make sure that each of those are going up during their time with me.
yeah, and just coming from a sociological and political science background, you know, there's some kind of there's some archetypes in people's behavioral patterns that are based on their ideology, based on their religion, based on whatever. And if they have this mindset that there's role specific duties that like a man's supposed to do this, a woman's supposed to do that, right? And then it's like, is that partnership really equal? Is that partnership even talked about in terms of like, is there a possibility for coordination? If
Mm-hmm.
you have people that don't have that idea, like they don't have a shared bank account, they
Mm-hmm.
don't they don't make shared decisions, they kind of top down decisions. Those type of structures are like more likely to have tension and problems.
I think it depends on if the unknown remains unknown and unspoken, or if the unknown is known and discussed. So if with couples that have a certain cultural background or experience where there might be a division of labor, or there's certain standards that you could say, or cultural norms about what one spouse or one gender might do, as long as you've talked about that and you're on the same page, and as long as you can return to that topic later if something in life might change. Let's say that the kids are a little bit older, the stay-at-home wife now wants to go get a college degree and start a career that she's always been interested in, or the stay-at-home husband for that matter. Then, as long as there's a place to be able to talk about those things, then it definitely can work and is definitely compatible. I think the issue that I see is when resentment comes up from all the unspoken conversations, that I just accept this sense of learned helplessness that I've been cooking and cleaning and preparing a home for 25 years, and that's my plight in life, and there's no way for me to break out of that. That's when it tends to cause issues.
Yeah, if you have that kind of a people pleaser, right? And so the people pleaser, everybody expects them to, and they've never seen them not be a people pleaser. And suddenly when they hit the critical mass, that kind of the outburst that happens, or the kind of situation that happens when they hit that critical moment, like nobody expected it. And they're like, "Well, I didn't know you wanted that. I didn't know that you needed that because you never told me that."
Right. And as we know from sociology and psychology, that any change to a system is going to cause a little bit of tension for a period of time. So, the first month that in-home parent decides to then go pursue their career, there's going to be some missed dinners, there's going to be laundry piling up, like there's going to be some issues that then need to be figured out. But as long as you're talking to each other, as long as you're flexible in your system, those things can be solved.
Yeah, it's interesting. Because like if you have a true partnership with your spouse, they it seems like you're working together instead of working against each other. I've seen like a lot of relationships, just in my years on the planet, where it's like a lot of drama,
Mm-hmm.
and it doesn't seem to be good drama.
No.
And it's like, okay, why is this like? And sometimes people just stay because they feel obligated, because of children, because of business relationships, because of family relationships. It's like family structures that kind of dictate that we don't like how it looks if you don't stay in this marriage. And so it's like people get stuck because of the ceilings they perceive. And maybe, you could always change it, but maybe if you don't perceive you could change it, then you don't think you can change it.
Yeah, I mean, you certainly have to have the possibility in your mind, or the hope of change, before maybe you pursue it. And there are definitely real obstacles. I whether it's financial, I've worked with couples that have been married a long time, and they say, listen, our lives will be very different if we divorce and have two homes based on our retirement, plan. And that's a reality that, we have to talk about in some of these sessions. And, for some people, it's telling the kids, like I remember one couple, like their daughter was about to get married and they were at a retreat, probably getting divorced. And so they're like, well, this is not really good timing.
It's like good timing, but sometimes things happen like the way they happen. Is like, you're trying to keep it like hidden or not have it blow up. But sometimes, I'm a Buddhist. Like if something was supposed to happen, it's supposed to happen.
Yeah. Yeah, this reminds me, when I was in high school, I had a girlfriend that I was dating that I was like, yeah, this isn't going to work out, but I kind of let it go for too long. And then the day I broke up with her was when we had a duet in the band recital, and it was just a disaster.
That's not the best moment, but maybe it had to be that way,
Yeah, who knows? But yeah, definitely letting it build and fester usually is going to make it worse.
So in terms of neuroscience, we talked about a little earlier about what methods do you use to help couples with neuroscience, and maybe like the different types of therapies that you can do with that.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, as I mentioned, my background is in neurofeedback, which is a form of brain training, and I was kind of introduced to the world of neuroscience through that process. And so a lot of what, in a general sense, a lot of what I'm thinking about with couples is, when you interact with each other, are you releasing happy hormones or stress hormones?
Mm.
Because if you're interacting with each other in a way that feels loving and caring, and even if it's a little challenging, but you're like, okay, we got through that, like, yeah, go us, high five or proverbial high five, that's going to feel connective. That's going to feel really positive. And if the majority of your interactions are like that, you're probably going to feel like your marriage is pretty good. But the issue is that when there are issues and challenges and tragedies in people's lives and marriages, the way they navigate that tends to cause more stress and the release of stress hormones, which is going to be the opposite of that connection with your partner. So some of the
Mm.
hormones, for example, are oxytocin. Oxytocin is a bonding hormone. We sometimes call it the hug hormone or the love hormone. Endorphins are the happy hormone. They're a real internal painkiller as well. And then, of course, dopamine, which reinforces a lot of that cycle too and makes you want to go towards your partner. And so in a fundamental sense, that's a lot of how I'm conceptualizing the space and the interactions in the room. In a more nuanced way, I see a lot of couples that have been through horrific lives and have terrible trauma, childhood, adolescence, sexual trauma, physical abuse. I mean, whatever their story might be. And for those couples, their fight or flight response is just hyper ready at the go.
Those cortisol. So the cortisol is always showing up.
Yeah, I mean, and what I like to tell those couples is that your nervous system's only job is to keep you alive. Doesn't care about anything else. It just wants to keep you alive, keep you going to the next day. And so if you've had a threat in the past or a challenging experience, your nervous system has been trained to be on the lookout for that so that it can alert you and let you know, hey, you got to get out of this situation. But the issue is that our nervous system doesn't have the intelligence to understand the context, right? So you yelling at me because you're angry about something, if we're, married, is different than when my dad used to, yell at me and then pull out his belt because he's going to beat the crap out of me, right? We don't, the nervous system doesn't distinguish between those. Just a threat is a threat. So a lot of what I do then in the sessions is I do trauma work with the couple. And we talk about how to bring yourself back to baseline. We talk about how to ground alone or with each other before you then engage in a challenging conversation so that you have a fighting chance at those endorphins and happy hormones by the end of it.
Yeah, because you can see sometimes people, they have to kind of go to their corner and find a way to get out. And my dad was a sales guy, and he always found a way to like, okay, well, I'll just be out on the road. Like if things got too high, it's like, well, I'll just go and make a sale.
Right.
So it's like his way was just to go out the door. But still, because he had a job, they allowed him to like have that space. And then my mom was like kind of waiting for him to get back.
Right.
And so then it made it very stressful because like she was holding on to everything until he came back. And he was only back for certain amounts of time. So she felt like I didn't have enough time to actually say what I wanted. So it was always going to cause that kind of tension.
Yeah. And this is one of the reasons that with a lot of couples, I recommend scheduling check-ins with each other. And I have a very specific format that I teach couples and how to do a check-in and how to communicate with each other. But having a scheduled time is often really helpful because, like in your mom's case, she could say, all right, he's going away and doing his thing, but like, I know tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, we're going to have our check-in. So I can kind of be at ease because I know I'll have the opportunity to address this soon. And as long as both people keep the schedule and show up authentically, ready to have the conversation, that can work really well for a lot of couples.
Yeah, but that's where you have to talk about that. And I think there's a generation that didn't talk about that and made assumptions about, or, didn't really, we're talking past, even if you're talking past each other.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And, it's the kind of old, like, well, I put a roof over your head, right? It's that sort of mentality.
Yeah. It's like my way or the highway. Like, kind of like, it's like,
Yeah, exactly. Which
very
is an old school belief.
Yeah. And it's like, that doesn't have to be that absolute. The thing is, like, you learn over time. Like me and my wife, we've been married, for 25 years. And it's just like what you learn is like, I don't need to win every kind of conversation isn't about winning. Isn't about trying to get over It's like we have to like what is actually going on. Like, if there's something that's emotional, or I mean, it's not about like that. Like this issue, sometimes it's like I think people like they just it's a round one, round two. Is like what about actually just having a conversation?
Yeah.
And maybe it's not about like whether I have the point of view, my point of view is correct, or your point of view is like let's just talk about things and see where we have agreements and where we have disagreements, and it's not about trying to get over.
Oh, Phantom, you would have loved to have been a fly on the wall this last week because I worked with a couple that had one of them voted Republican in the last election, one of them voted Democrat,
Oh, that's a big fun.
and they had a lot of opposing views, but part of the work was getting them to hear each other and to build intimacy through opposing viewpoints, which it's challenging.
Yeah, it's very challenging because things are so kind of black and white today. It's kind of it's like on and off. I'm a software guy, so it's like computers like everything's 0 and 1. Everybody thinks they're very sophisticated, and they are. But when it comes down to it, it's either on or off, right? And it branches out, and it seems like it understands more than that, but it pretty much doesn't. Um, and so like trying to get to the gray areas, like the case statements, the if statements, like where you could go off on different areas. That's like opens like that. I think that's where the challenge is like people always have to be, well, this point of view is the correct point of view, and this way is the incorrect point of view, and nobody can have a conversation about what's the middle. Like the middle is getting like wiped out.
Yeah. Or even to say, based on what I understand, I think this is the right answer, but to be open to being wrong about that.
Yeah, I mean, being able to learn, and knowing if I was wrong yesterday, it's not the end of the world. Like musicians, we look at this idea of there's no bad note, there's an opportunity. If you're a jazz fusion modal jazz guy versus like classical music guy, he's reading Chopin, he has to hit that note exactly as it was on the page,
Right.
right? But a jazz musician, I could actually have some choices. I don't have to hit the note exactly the same way. I could actually go into a different scale. I could actually change it, and it's okay if I change it. But if you have the other mindset, it's like it's not okay to change it. You
Right.
have to stay on it.
Yeah, I just started taking guitar lessons again. I played when I was in high school a little, and to that point, the instructor was saying, if you make a mistake or you add an extra up on the strum, whatever, as long as you find that down again and you come back into sync and into
You can
rhythm, it's
recover.
gonna
Yeah,
sound pretty good, probably.
yeah, you can recover. It's like a lot of people like you might think you made a mistake, but like some of my music students say the crowd doesn't know you made a mistake unless you let them know you did.
Right.
Like so you can recover from anything musically as long as you like if you show like, well, I hit the wrong note, like you physically body language shows that you got the wrong, they're gonna all know you hit the wrong note, but you don't have to
Yeah.
do that.
Yeah, and with couples, I often tell them to fail together. If one of you says something you shouldn't say, then just like with couples, sometimes somebody will say something, they'll use the wrong word, a really judgmental term, or maybe
Mm,
even quasi racist or sexist or something, right? And I'll just tell their partner, just tell them to pick a different word, right?
yeah.
And then they pick a different word, and we move on. It doesn't have to be like a 20-minute vent session about how somebody used the wrong word. Like, okay, let's just give them a chance to correct it and continue on. Because you know what? You're going to do the same thing at some point. So if you give them a little grace, you'll get a little back too.
Yeah, I think grace and maybe some empathy,
Hmm.
um because a lot of times people are so hung up on their concepts, right? It's like if you believe like that the other is responsible for everything that happens wrong to you,
Yeah.
like you don't take any responsibility for the things that happen. He's like, well, it's because this, it's because my father did this, and my mom did this, and the principal did that, and my boss did that. So you never taking ownership of anything that you did. And so I think sometimes he's like that's a hard thing, that like the looking glass self, to kind of look at yourself and say, what is it that I could do better, and be honest about what you did that wasn't quite where you wanted to be. But you don't have to kill yourself for making a mistake. Like I find a lot of times happy accidents are actually really important in art.
Yeah.
So like I'm not going to freak out that I didn't get exactly what I wanted, because sometimes what I did off the cuff is better than what I wanted.
You're right. Right. Well, that's how we got the slinky, for example, right?
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Like you spend all the time trying to make this moment happen and then don't enjoy the present. And then in a relationship, that could cause a lot of problems if you don't actually embrace the present moment. You're always trying to embrace this kind of perfect moment instead of the moments that are actually happening in front of you.
Yeah, I think the phrase is perfection is the enemy of progress.
Yeah. And creativity too.
And creativity. Absolutely. Yeah.
So in terms of getting angry, which everybody's a human thing, but when you're in a marriage, is like, how is the best way to really, come down or tone down or take it down to get people to not be screaming at each other, not yelling at each other, not slamming doors and banging things and throwing things?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a few different ways. First of all, anger in general is often seen as kind of a superficial emotion especially in Western culture. And what I mean by that is that there's something behind it. In particular, a lot of men have been socialized that they can express anger as an emotion, but they can't express embarrassment or shame or sadness or grief or any of these other negative, unpleasant feelings. And so it gets masked as anger. For a lot of women that have trauma, men too, but for a lot of women that have trauma, people that have trauma, anger is a don't F with me signal. If
Mhm.
you're angry, people probably aren't going to approach you, right? So it's almost like a safety mechanism in that case.
The shield.
Yeah, exactly. So when I'm working with couples where anger management is checked off on the intake form, then a lot of times what I try to do is assess the reason for it first, right? So if it's, well, I'm trying to communicate with them and they're not listening, I don't feel heard. Okay, so you need to feel heard. We need to kind of change the way you're communicating then so you can feel heard potentially, or change the way they're listening so you can feel heard. It could be either one of those. If the anger is coming from a place of I don't feel safe, then okay, we need to do some trauma work potentially, right? So understanding the root of it is important. From the communication side, though, I often tell couples if you would like to have an emotional connection with your partner, you need to share your emotions.
Mhm.
So the question that I almost always get is, well, what do I do when I'm feeling angry? What do I do when I'm feeling defensive? Say it. I'm feeling really defensive right now. I'm
Yeah,
feeling really
explain it.
angry right
Yeah,
now.
explain it. Yeah. Actually,
Right. And
yeah.
then that's the start of the conversation. You have to go deeper then, but like own it and talk about it then.
Yeah, 'cause I think people, like, they tried to shield, like, a mask, like, as a songwriter, we like to, like, put levels on things, we use, like, we have a lot of double layers or multiple layers of meaning. It's kinda like a Victorian poet talking about little death.
Mhm.
Little death isn't the direct word for having, an orgasm, but it's like they would hide things and not be direct. But, like, when you're in a relationship, you need to be more direct and not be as subtle, right? You should actually talk about what you're actually feeling and not try to mask it or come up with a word to cover it with,
Yeah.
like you said, like a lot of men is like they're feeling depressed, they act angry. They're feeling melancholy, act angry. Instead of actually saying like I'm actually really melancholy about this. Instead, they think the correct emotion for them is, for their manliness is to be angry.
Yeah, and the irony is that a lot of that's actually well-meaning, right? I don't want to upset my partner. I don't want to make them uncomfortable, so I'm going to hold back that negative stuff so they don't have to feel it. And I understand that intention, but it really has an ironic, paradoxical effect because by withholding the feeling and not wanting them to feel uncomfortable, I'm actually creating a lack of intimacy and I'm creating disconnection. So then they feel really uncomfortable, and then we end up years later at this disconnected place. And the most extreme example of this was a couple that I saw a number of years ago where he had an affair because he was attending orgies.
Oh, geez.
And so when they came into therapy, you can imagine that this was a topic of conversation. And he said, well, I it's fun. I enjoy, all these different things he was talking about. I said, have you ever invited your wife? Did you ever even ask if she would join you? And he was like, no. And so I said, ask her. And she was like, yeah, I would try it. I would go. And I was like,
And
man,
that's a total missed opportunity.
you could have saved yourself years of hiding it and lying. And, he had multiple cell phones and online account. Like, it was so much work he was going through to hide this thing that his wife was totally into.
Yeah, that's the communication gap. Is like in terms of like because you have this mind. Well, yeah, I mean, you see that filter on your wife. He's like, well, she wouldn't be into that, but
Yeah.
you never asked her, right? And you just assume because you filter, and maybe she was giving you cues, but your filter like is missing the cues, and it's happening where you actually went back. You probably could have picked up there were some cues, but you didn't even want to pick up on those because you filtered like, well, she's not into that.
Yeah, and maybe you're making some assumptions. Well, she's a good Catholic girl, so that wouldn't happen, or whatever it is. And actually, there's a term for this too. The Madonna complex.
Mm.
So the Madonna complex is when you don't feel like you can shame your wife by doing wild, sexual, kinky kinds of things because she's pure, she's the mother of your kids, and you can't defile her in that way. And the reality is that, again, if you had some chemistry, if you had fun when you were younger, people often like to experiment a little, or they have fantasies in mind. And so your fantasy might not be exactly the same as your partner, but it might surprise you.
Yeah, because the people are not being inventive enough or not being more of an open book, and then they go off to find it somewhere else because they like, and then that causes the more disconnection. And in music we talk about like harmony and discordance and dissonance, and we're kind of vibing with the like members of your band, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of nonverbal communication when you have a really good band, right? Because every member kind of complements the other, and we all are kind of vibing in a frequency where like it works,
right?
Because we trust each other and we communicate with each other, even on stage. We're nodding and giving looks, and it's like we know how to talk to each other. Well, you need to be able to talk like that with your spouse.
You do, and the nonverbal is also important. This is making me think of foreplay. That some people think that they have to, they want to talk about sex right before, or make like a game plan, or right after they need to discuss things, or it can feel really awkward to like talk about these things and flirt with each other and experiment with each other, and not just with your clothes off, but like experiment with your clothes on, and different ways of flirting, different ways of talking to each other. And that's again where I often recommend these scheduled check-ins, because sometimes you can have a check-in that is about, so how was the flirting the last week? Or we tried some different things, like I want to debrief about this. Did it feel comfortable? Was it what was it like for you? Did you have other fantasies? And I find that a lot of couples are very motivated to have the sexual check-ins, that maybe less so about other parts of the relationship.
Yeah, it's harder because then you start getting into the hard conversations that might be a little controversial because you're not on the same page. And it's about like trying to get like at least some kind of agreement.
Yeah, although to be honest, I find that when couples talk about sex, it's usually a parallel to everything else in their relationship and marriage. There's power dynamics, there's clear communication, there's avoidance, right? There's safety and security and trust. There's, some people need intimacy before they engage in more sexual acts, right? So it often becomes this metaphor for everything else that's going on in the relationship.
That's interesting. And also, like, do you ever run into people that like, well, they think it takes like the I don't know, the magic out of a moment if you talk about it? It's almost like they feel like it just should happen, kind of some kind of organic thing without talking, which it seems kind of counterintuitive. And maybe it's just this kind of belief that it's just supposed to happen. If it's supposed to happen, it would just happen and unfold in the moment, and it doesn't have to be like planned or discussed. It's just going to happen
Yeah.
because there's like that spark or that chemistry that makes it happen. It's this magical thing that you can't really fully define, but
Yeah. I
you
mean,
actually could define it.
that definitely happens. And unfortunately, I think, porn plays a role in that. A lot of people, when they're watching porn, you're missing, like, those actors are debriefing, they're checking in with each other. I mean, there is communication going on, but you just see the highlight reel. You're not looking at all the things that go into it. So, and same with Hollywood movies, right? People have a glance and it's like they can read their minds in Hollywood. And
Yeah, so it kind of sets everybody up to thinking that that's how it's supposed to happen. So
right,
it's
and
like,
that portrayal is just unrealistic. So yeah, that does come up a lot. And oftentimes what I tell people is, well, you've been trying that for 10 years. How's it work for you?
it doesn't work. Yeah, it's like if you actually have a true conversation, and you, it's not about like if you're back in college and you're at the frat party, you're at the dance party, and you hook up, that's not like if you're gonna have your when you're with your partner, like you have these conversations, you walk on the beach, it's just some deeper thing that happens. It's not always that somehow that off the cuff moment that just kind of like I would say like when you're doing improvisation in a band,
Hmm.
like it's kind of an unplanned thing and you have very magical. But a lot of the time when we're doing that performance, we spend a lot of time rehearsing
Hmm.
and we have these unplanned things that happen. But to make it the whole thing happen, we did a lot of rehearsal. We actually
Right.
did a lot of pre work. And so that work has to happen, right?
That's a really good metaphor. Before the performance, there's a lot of rehearsal that goes into it. I think that's a really good metaphor. And, to build on that, again, coming back to this stereotype of the men and the women, about 50% of men over 50 have some form of erectile dysfunction. And
Mhm.
a lot of the reasons for that, from my understanding of the literature, is that around age 40 to 50, men need more emotional connection to be aroused and feel sexually interested than when
Mhm.
they're younger. And
Mhm.
so, when I have men come in that are 45 to 55, 60, even, in that range, we'll often talk about that. Like, if you're expecting your equipment to work in your fit when you're 57 like it did when you're 17, that's just
Yeah.
not going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm 57, I kinda know. But, yeah, because I think people maybe that's an assumption that maybe, people think about men is like, "Well, you're just gonna be, like, roused." But what if it takes more? And also, you gotta think about the context. If we were having, like, a really kind of, deep conversation or something was happening in the day, those emotional things that happen during the day are going to affect the intimacy time, and it's going to bleed in. And if that's still in your head, you might have a hard time performing because you might still have this other stuff going on in your head, and you're not connecting to the moment. You're still thinking about those other moments.
Yeah, but again, what I would recommend is that talking about those would actually, for most people, lighten the load. I like this idea of sunlight is the best disinfectant. If you have an old pair of gym shoes, that are smelly and gross, and you put them out on a sunny day, the UV rays kill the bacteria. It's going to smell really good. It's not going to restore it to its full original form, but it's going to do a pretty darn good job. And, emotions tend to work the same way. If you keep your emotions down, dark inside you, they're going to fester and cause issues. If you bring them up and your partner can greet them with warmth and sunshine, so to speak, it can actually pretty quickly dissipate.
Yeah, so that's like the people just not building up the resentments because that's why
Yeah.
a lot of times people they don't talk about the things that really affect them. Because
Hmm.
somebody could say something and, and they hold on to it. Maybe they don't respond to it. So the other person has no idea that what they said affected them like in such a way.
Yeah.
And then the next time it maybe comes up, the other person has no idea why you're so, you know, freaking out about something because you never said something before. And now you're saying something.
Right. And I mean, this is so much of the time, this is the argument that I hear, right? Somebody says, well, you never brought it up before. And then it just shuts the person down because it's like, well, I'm trying to bring it up now.
Yeah.
um, Yeah, I mean that's so common, that avoidance, and it almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because if I haven't been bringing something up because I think it's going to create a fight, and then I finally bring it up and it creates a fight, hey, I was right. So I'm not going to bring
Right.
it up anymore.
Now you're never gonna bring it up again. Instead of actually trying to find out, like, can we get some middle ground on this? Can we have a discussion? Does it have to go into fireworks, or can we actually sit down and talk about what we need to talk about? And that's like the adult thing to do in the room is like eventually you have to get out of uh maybe a mindset that's not as mature, like the emotional intelligence is like sometimes we don't have it and we have to grow into it. And so if you're still acting like you did in high school, act like you did in college, and everything is still framed in that mind frame, and you're like 55 and you're still seeing things the way in that way, it's like, whoa, that maybe that's not very productive.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's tricky here because we talked about blaming earlier, and it made me think of defensiveness. And a lot of times I've heard somebody say, well, I don't bring it up because they just get defensive, right? And I like to remind them that actually defensiveness is usually a feature of the speaker, not the listener who's getting defensive.
Hmm.
So, for example, if I say to you, when I come home from work, you never give me a hug anymore, you know? So I'm blaming you for something, which means it's human nature to defend yourself, right? You're going to
Yeah.
get defensive, as opposed to changing that in a way that I own the experience and say what I want. So, hey, when I come home from work and I've had a really hard day, I want a chance to reconnect with you, and just a hug, a kiss, an acknowledgement, a quick conversation would mean the world to me. It's really hard to defend yourself against that statement.
Yeah, it's like you got to think about what you say, and I think a lot of times we don't really think out the words that are coming out of our mouths.
I agree. Yeah.
And like if you're a writer, you really think about things, right? But if you like a lot of times, people don't really stop, and it's like, well, how should I say this to get this kind of impact? They just want to say what's at the top of their head, what the top of their mind, and it sometimes won't work out that well because it'll be that kind of situation where you're putting the blame on the other person, and then
Yeah.
because if that's the way you've always spoken and you never thought about it, you didn't have that looking glass analysis, you never taped yourself, recorded yourself, and then listened to what the way you talk, right? And then you realize like, oh, that's how I approach the world. This is what I'm saying to people. If I went back and listened to how I talked during the day, maybe I would have some second thoughts about how I'm actually doing it.
Yeah. Yeah, I oftentimes I suggest couples record a conversation, and there's a specific way that I have them review it. But I mean, you're also making me think of music again. As a musician, you need to know the chords you can play, the scale that you're in, the notes you can play. And yeah, you can play a wrong note as long as you come back to the
Yeah.
format, right? But give your guitar to someone who's never played before, it's going to sound terrible. And
Yeah,
so,
especially you have an alternate tuning and they didn't know you did.
right, exactly, yeah.
So that's kind of things that we do. We have our little secret sauces, and so like, it's not gonna really work in your hands if you don't know that. Yeah, it's just I think people have to understand the frame they're in. Like I've talked to filmmakers, and it's like how I present this scene. I can keep on changing the lighting. I can change the shadows. I can change this. I'm trying to get a reaction, and they're spending a lot of time frame by frame trying to understand what people are going to see and what their vision is, and they're really trying to execute that way. And it's almost like, well, in life you're like, can you actually take the time to think about the frame or the filters that you're using?
And that requires perspective. And, getting back to your question about some of the neuroscience behind this. So I do offer brain mapping to couples as well. That's an add-on for the retreat if they're interested in it. And the brain map is an EEG analysis where we can see how their brain is processing experiences and information. And so sometimes there'll be someone who shows some slowing in their anterior cingulate, which is often indicative of like an OCD and rumination. And
Mhm.
so they can see like, yeah, you get stuck on things your partner says because this area of your brain is getting stuck. Or, you don't have a verbal filter because of slowing in your dorsolateral maybe. And so again, you're just going to say whatever's on your mind. And so there are strategies to put in place for those couples that slows it down.
That's
Just
the
like in music, you're trying to learn a new skill, slow it down.
Yeah, well, that's the whole thing about a song is like when we rehearse, we slow everything down till we get it like at like half the speed of what we were gonna do, and then gradually bring it up to like the level. But we have to know the notes. We have
Right.
to understand like the intensity of the notes. Like how are we really gonna do an attack with this? Are we gonna kind of do a vibrato, or are we gonna do a crescendo, a decrescendo, like how we the dynamics are very important in music, especially playing acoustic instruments. Like the dynamics of like, do you really need to be that loud, or do you need do you need to have a little space between the notes, or the silence between the notes? Like a lot of times as a musician, we find that like if you have some silence between the notes, they have more impact. And
Mhm.
I think that kind of relates also to communication because talking is like in an instrument. Your voice is an instrument. Like singers, their voice is their instrument. So if you think about leaving some space between your words or your statements for response time or impact time for people to actually get, you know, have enough time to process what you're saying.
Yeah, one of my favorite quotes is from a yoga founder at a center, and it's, before speaking, consider if it's an improvement upon silence.
That's a
And
good
I
thing.
like that notion. Like, what are you adding to this game right now?
Yeah, and musicians, we always end up pulling things out. Like
Yeah.
we do what we call sound painting, and we layer the sound. And sometimes we go back and we say, you know what, we put too many layers on this.
Hmm.
So we start pulling stuff out to be able to get more impact. To like, this is really what we're trying to say. This other stuff is superfluous. I didn't need that, so I pull it
Yeah.
out.
It's one of the
So
reasons people like Tiny Desk concerts, right? Because it's just distilled down into the essence.
yeah, if you can distill down to like unplugged, tiny desk, like when somebody plays an acoustic version of a song without all the layers,
Yeah.
sometimes it has a lot more vulnerability and impact than all the layers that maybe made it too perfect, too stack, it's too precise, too clean. Like
Yep.
it's I sometimes you need something to have a little edge and some dissonance and some microtonal or micro timing errors actually important to art. Like imperfections actually make art. It's
Well, and I think
sometimes
that
not the perfection I think that does it.
Yeah, and I think that's part of intimacy with couples as well. That if you're willing to be vulnerable and potentially make a mistake in front of your partner, it's like if you have a solo, if you're soloing and you're worried about playing the wrong note, right? It's probably going to be sort of mechanical. Whereas if you can just flow with it and go with it, and you make a mistake but you go back, and like, I mean, that's gonna what gives it that authenticity and that that
Yeah.
that edge. Then
That's why people like, live musicians aren't gonna, I don't think AI is gonna replace a real authentic live musician playing a sax or a guitar or singing. That heart and soul that's in the human being is not in
Mhm.
the large learning library. It's not there. Not at least not yet. And so
Yeah.
until they can feel pain and sadness, till like a computer can say, well, yeah, I had this really bad day. And I can express that when I create this art. I have not seen that. I've seen them mimic somebody else's pain, but not
Right.
their own pain.
Right. Right. Yeah, no, and I mean, sometimes what I tell couples when I teach the communication skills is that, I'm showing you the scales, and you need to know your scales. You need to be able to play them and rehearse them. But then as we work together through this retreat, you're going to learn improvisation, because no one just plays scales when you're
Yeah.
actually a
Yeah.
musician.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, there's going to be things that I recommend to you that maybe don't feel like they're a good fit. Okay, let's leave it off for right now. There's going to be something that I typically say, you probably shouldn't do this for most couples, but for you, it seems to work. Great. So let's bring it back in. And that's part of the process, is finding like, what is your authentic sound, if you will, for your relationship.
Yeah, one size doesn't fit all. There's a lot of people like to have like guys 10 steps and 5 steps, and this is gonna get you this. And usually, like everybody has a unique approach, and sometimes you have to have a unique approach to handle different situations. There's certain things that are common, but you have kind of read the room. Is this idea of like reading the room?
Yeah.
If you read the room, then you'll kind of know if you're bombing. A comedian knows that. Musicians also can feel that too. Like we immediately make a course correction if we see it. Oh, this isn't working. You
Yeah.
know?
I think part of the issue in relationships, though, is that the blame is put on other people, right? If you were a musician and you're bombing and you blame the audience, that's not going to go very well.
That doesn't work because then you get this eggs and tomatoes thrown at you. What do you get? Like, but if you course correct, if you make the change,
Right.
then the audience picks up on it, and then you save the show. But
Yeah.
it's like up to you. But if you're in the blame game, it's like, oh, the audience just doesn't get it. Like, well, you need to make them get it.
Yeah, one of my favorite assignments to give couples is to make a list of a couple ways that you sabotage your relationship and how you could fix it. Because it really makes people introspect on, like, yeah, I'm mad at you because we don't have good conversations, but what am I doing that contributes to that? And I make almost every couple goes through that exercise, because there's so much blaming that goes on. And,
Yeah,
what I tell them is, if you can at least take some ownership and then start to change yourself, usually when you're making changes, your partner can feel that and see that, and it motivates them to do it. And it creates this synergy with the two of you rather than just slinging tomatoes back and forth.
Which you kind of like remapping, behavior. It's like, no, I mean, in my software, we have what we call, functional changes or basic structural changes, and then we have functional changes. Like a structural change is I'm actually changing the table. I'm actually adding columns into the table that weren't there. Like, like a functional change, I might actually just change a value in a column. So it's just a little bit of an adjustment. But if I have to pull tables in or out or columns in and out, then I actually have to change the programming of the program's going to have to change to match that.
Yeah, I think most couples need both.
Yeah, you have to you have to do both of them at the same time, that's a lot of work. Because like in my world, that's actually that's a 6-month project. you know,
Yeah, I mean, the good news is that, we've got some good stats that about 85% of the couples that come to see me have really good improvements in just 3 or 4 days. And, part of what I tell them is, honestly, I'm not going to fix every problem in your relationship in 3 or 4 days, but we're going to hit the main ones, and I'm going to teach you how to do it so you can replicate this and follow the process when you leave here, so when you're on your own.
Oh, so they can learn how to help themselves. It's kind of like, you teach somebody to fish. It's better than just giving them a fish,
Exactly. Yeah, I'm going to teach you to fish, and ideally, teach you where to fish.
Yeah. So you know how to get, like, you're actually gonna get gold. You're gonna find that. One day when I'm out on on the wall, but the idea is like you want to teach people how to communicate better, live together better, and stay. Your goal is to have people like have a marriage that's actually thriving and
Yeah.
working, right?
Yeah, most of the couples that see me are doing discernment counseling. And at the end of the retreat, like I said, about 85% of people report that they feel optimistic enough to continue their marriage and keep working on it. And it's been wonderful to be part of that and help them get there.
Well, that's a cool societal goal, the macrocosm. Because like if you can take every couple, that the microcosm aspect of each couple, and you solve their problems, the more couples that are functioning cause less social ills. I'm a sociologist. Like a lot of things come from the family. A lot of
Yeah.
structural problems in society come from dysfunctional families, trigger all kinds of behavioral patterns that just percolate through society and just exponentially compound. And if you can start one marriage at a time, that's a cool goal that's like achievable.
Yeah. Absolutely. My hope is to be able to train therapists in this, because, we talked about that divorce rate around 50%, but no one is ever taught how to be married in my experience. Like even the grad school classes I took were on like divorce and family conflict and
You
these
talk
kinds of
about like you
things.
learn how to stay in it.
Yeah, exactly. And so, it's no wonder. Like, imagine that there was no carpentry schools or education. Like, how many houses would fall over,
Yeah,
right? Like,
yeah, you
it's
gotta know
no
how to build
surprise then.
that house. A marriage is like, the carpentry to keep your relationship together. And if you're not a good carpenter, well, that wall doesn't have a good A-frame on it. It's gonna, wind hits it, boom. You know,
Yeah. Or you're going to end up with slow rot if you didn't weatherproof properly.
yeah, you just got to figure out like what's important. And I think people are starting to realize like, hey, I don't have training for this.
Mhm.
Right. I don't know how to actually do this. And, we are people who like to, the human brain is like kind of needs to be like trained. You need to do the rehearsal, you need to do the practice. You have to, you don't build up to get to be successful without breaking some eggs, without doing the work.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And then unfortunately, I do offer premarital retreats, but most people come to see me when there's a crisis. But I'd be happy to do preventative work if anyone ever, reached out for that. The research on marriage therapy is most people show up 5 years later than they should on average. In my experience, it's like 10 to 20 years later than they should, but sure, maybe five too.
well, at least the people would try, and if they can recover from at that point, then that's really positive too. But I
Mhm.
want to thank you for being on the show. We do have your marriagequest.org/marriage slash retreat. People will be able to click on that. If they click on it, is that how people sign up for your retreat?
Yep. So that page has information on the retreats. It talks about the process. There's a sample itinerary. It talks about the kinds of issues that we, deal with: sexless marriages, affairs, considering divorce, resentment, and much more. And then we offer every couple a free consultation. And just so people know, this is not a $20 copay kind of service. This is an investment, and so we're really looking for couples that are ready to take it seriously and that they're looking for change in their marriage and relationship. And it's like I said, we've got good success, so happy to help anyone that's motivated and ready.
Well, I want to thank you for being a guest on the show tonight, and have a happy 4th of July. And thank you for being on the show.
Yeah, thanks so much, Phantom, again for the invite. It was fun and a pleasure, and happy 4th to you and the listeners.
Thank you.